What's going on, everyone? In this video today, we're going to break down how you can deal with your wrist rolling in the bench press so you can make your bench press more efficient, lift more weight, and dominate on the platform. So as always, let's get right into the video. What's going on, my powerlifting people? Thank you for checking out the channel and tuning into another video. And if you're new here to the channel and you don't know who I am, my name is Aaron Kamesi. I'm a powerlifting coach, athlete, referee, and meet director. So I make videos here on this channel to help out those groups of people. Like I said in the intro, in this video today, we're going to go over a user submitted question going over the wrist rolling and the bench press. So someone sent me this question or topic, but they didn't really break down what their specific issue was. They didn't send me any videos. So let's do a generic video where we go and problem solve this issue and figure out how it's occurring, basically diagnosing the problem and then figuring out how we can fix it depending on what exactly the issue is and when it occurs. All right, so let's get started with the diagnosing phase. And this can be with any issue you're having as far as technique or even beyond powerlifting, is you want to go and diagnose the issue and figure out when it's happening. So for example, in the bench press, you want to figure out if it's happening on the way down or if it's happening on the way up. So that could be one thing you can look at is watch your videos and see, is your wrist in the proper position and then staying in that position on the way down, and only when you go and press is it rolling, or is it rolling like as soon as you unrack the bar and you start your descent, it's automatically rolling. So that's one of the things you can look into because it can be different things. For example, if your wrists are already rolled back as soon as you unrack the bar, or as soon as you start your descent, you kind of crank your wrist back and then go down, then that can be a technique thing, and you have to just learn the proper technique and holding those joints in position that you don't want to move. Whereas if it's happening on the way up, and maybe it's also happening on the way up with heavier weight, then it could be that you know the proper technique and you're doing it properly on the way down, but on the way up you just don't have the strength for it, or with enough weight maybe just mentally kind of freak out and forget about your technique and then the wrist roll. So one of those sub points when it comes to when it occurs with this issue with the bench press or any issue is whether the weight is a factor. If you're warming up with 50-60% and your technique looks perfect, but once you start getting to 85-90%, your technique breaks down. Again, it could be a mental issue where you're forgetting your technique and having things break down once you stress out because you have a heavier load on your back or in your hands, and so then you're just forgetting everything and just kind of going up as fast as you can. Whereas if it's happening with lighter weights, let's say it's 50% or even the empty bar and you can't do things correctly, then it could be that one, you don't know the proper technique, or two, that maybe you lack the mobility to do the proper technique. So figure out when the issue is occurring as far as the descent versus the ascent, and whether it's happening with lighter loads versus heavier loads. Next, when we go specifically into the wrist rolling, we can talk about whether the wrist is rolling forward, which I consider this direction, or backward, which is this direction. So there could be different reasons for why it would roll this way or why it would roll that way. So then that's another thing that you need to diagnose. If you're talking to an expert, a coach, a doctor, whatever issue is as far as pain or technique issue, is you want to be descriptive and detailed if you're not providing videos of what's happening, because you can roll this way and you can roll that way. So when someone told me this question, I don't know which way they're talking about. I mean, a lot of people will do roll backwards this way, but some people do roll forward this way and maybe even lose the bar because of it. All right, and when it comes to rolling either direction, part of it can also just be where your wrist is when you first start. So we can talk about wrist flexion, neutral wrist, and wrist extension. So depending on where you have it, then maybe then can cause one thing or another to occur. So a lot of people are trying to get to a neutral wrist, which is for a lot of people it does work, but some people for neutral wrist, what they think is neutral is different than what actually is. A lot of people try and get their hand to be straight like this, but actually this is not a neutral wrist. This is slightly flexed, and actually feel my forearm muscles working a little bit to create this flexed position. So a lot of people think just because their hand is straight like this when your palm is open, that when they close their palm, that this is a neutral wrist, but this is actually slightly flexed. What you want to get a neutral wrist is try and get your wrist neutral and your hand straight and everything like that, and then don't move your wrist joint at all, just close your hand. So now when I close my hand, you can see there's actually a slight upward angle from the hand going up to the knuckles, because that's just how your hand is built and you're creating that fist. It's going to make this angle, but the wrist joint itself is still a neutral wrist here, not here. Okay, we don't want to have the back of the hand being straight. We want to get the wrist neutral. So what you can do, again, have your hand straight like this, keep your wrist locked, and then close your hand, and then you'll see that slight angle. And then of course, if you want to get the other way into extension, then obviously you would extend it further and really incline that angle of the hand. So then that would be extension. So now if you have your wrist slightly flexed or very flexed, and we have now a barbell with weight in our hand, what can happen is now if you start bringing your hand into a slight flexion, is now the bar can be forward of the elbow. And if you start bringing it more and more, then the bar can be very far of the elbow. And also it can then be more and more difficult to hold because now it's not sitting in the palm and sitting above the wrist joint. Now it's kind of sitting in this open space here and in front of the wrist joint. And depending on how strong you are and how much weight there is, it could slip out, especially if you do a suicide grip with that too now and you're slightly flexed with a suicide grip. You can see it's completely open here. Depending on how strong your grip is, whether you chalk your hands, how much the weight is, then it can slip out. Or you can just have it slightly forward, and with enough weight, then it can, go more and more forward on you. So if you're having that forward rolling this direction, then it could just be that your hand is a little bit too much into flexion. You're not actually neutral, and you want to focus on making that adjustment. So again, hand open. You can put the bar in there, close your hand. You can see this slight angle here. So now I got my wrist more neutral. You can see the bar is over the wrist joint, and that force of gravity and the weight is going to go straight down into my palm and into my wrist joint, and it's going to be more difficult to roll forward or into flexion. Now, if you have the other issue where it's rolling back on you, one possible problem is that you could have it too high in your hand, okay? So you want to get it deep into our palm as low as possible. That's partly why some people do suicide grip and it feels easier, because you can obviously get the bar lower and deeper into the palm, closer to the wrist joint without the thumb in the way. But when we have to wrap the thumb around, then it's going to bring the bar a little bit higher, but we still want to get it as deep into the palm as possible. Okay, and we don't want it up in our fingers. So if you have it high in your hand and high in your fingers, then what could happen is it could possibly roll back on you. Okay, whether your hand stays closed and it rolls back on you, and now the bar again is not in line with my wrist joint or my elbow, or it can actually, if people don't grip the bar tight enough, then it can actually like roll back into their fingers sometimes like that. And again, in front of the wrist joint and in front of the elbow. So you want to try and get it as deep into the palm as possible. So one way you can do that with an empty bar or just like, a dumbbell handle like this is when you have it in your hand, okay, think about slowly opening your fingers up and getting it deep into, so if I show it this way, deep into this U part shape of the thumb, okay? So if I open my hand up, then I'm getting it deep in there. And then you can just close your fingers over the top of it, okay? If you're just grabbing the bar from wherever, then you may not be getting as deep as possible, and you may have a little bit of a gap here on this side, or you may have a little bit of gap on this side. So from there, you wanna open your hand and let it roll all the way down here, okay? To close that gap, close all this gap as deep as possible. And then from there, you can put your fingers wrapped around, or even what some people will do, which I like kind of doing too a little bit, is pushing down a little bit like that. Okay, so I'm still gripping the bar. I'm just trying to push down with the inside of my hand and getting it deep into the palm. So that way it's going to be deeper in the palm, closer to the wrist joint, and less likely to roll up your fingers and go behind the wrist joint, behind the elbows, and roll your wrist back. From there are some more advanced methods of the bar placement, and like I said, the finger grip and how wide you go and if you turn your hand in, everything like that. But one more advanced way is to purposely extend your wrist back some. And part of the key to that is if I can get as deep as possible into my palm, okay? From here, it's not gonna matter if I bend my wrist back much because the bar is not gonna move much because the bar is so low in my palm that my palm is not actually moving that much. So here, okay, when I have my wrist turned in a little bit and also deep in the palm and gripping it like this, okay, I can have my wrist more neutral, but if I also flex it back, it's staying over the wrist joint still and staying over the elbow. If you have it in your fingers, then obviously then it's going to be very far back in the wrist joint. But if I get deep into the palm, then it's not going to matter. So some people will purposely extend their wrist back some, which I do, and it feels better for me that way because I have it so deep in my palm that now it's not going anywhere. Another thing that can help with basically keeping your wrist locked in place, once you have the bar basically deep into the palm and you have the position you want, whether you want neutral or slightly extended and you want to lock it in place, is to then wear wrist wraps. So the wrist wraps are going to help basically create a cast over the wrist joint to hold it in place and not have it move while you're pushing big weight. So personally, I don't use wrist wraps wraps these days. I do like it where I don't have the wrist wraps. I have it deep in my palm and slightly extended. But if you are someone who holds a little bit more neutral and maybe you feel like your wrist is going to roll one way or the other, then you can wear that wrist wrap to create that cast to hold in place and so that your wrist is not going to move anywhere, and then you won't have that wrist roll. If you have any further questions about the wrist rolling in the bench press, then be sure to comment those below and I answer all my comments. If you want to learn more about specifically the bench grip, then you can check out this video I have here where I go over grip width. And if you want to just learn other tips and tricks when it comes to the bench press, you can check out my bench press tips playlist right here. Other than that, hope you guys are having a great day and I'll see you in the next video.